On June 9th, 2014, a relatively unknown rebel group stormed across the Syrian and Iraqi border and in just one day captured the second largest city of Iraq, Mosul. Infamously known as ISIS, the world took notice as they went on a violent campaign to establish the Islamic Caliphate, and no one was going to get in their way, especially vulnerable ethnic and religious minorities. On that same searing hot day in June, just 40 kilometres away at the Kabul International Airport, my young family also arrived in Iraq. And behind me is a photo of my beautiful wife and two of our children having just stepped off an excruciatingly long plane journey into blazing 45-degree heat. Short disclaimer, she did not give me permission to share that photo, so I will be asking for forgiveness later. But Sarah, you are remarkable and you are my hero. But here we were, completely oblivious to the chaos that was happening just an hour's drive to the west. It wasn't until we drove the 2-hour winding road past 7 army checkpoints over 3 mountain ranges to our new hometown of Saran that we were informed by the locals about the nearby ISIS invasion. At one point, I remember looking over at my wife, Sarah, and 3 children who were just 3 years, 2 years, and 9 weeks old at the time, and thinking to myself, what have you done? Daily, thousands of families were on the move, escaping certain death or enslavement as ISIS swept through village after village. More than 2 million men, women and children flooded into our region known as Kurdistan. UN refugee camps were rapidly set up while other families sought shelter in unfinished buildings or in makeshift shelters on the side of the road. For our family, life felt surreal as we spent the next 3 months trying to settle into our new home amidst a growing and overwhelming humanitarian crisis. We were scrambling to get visas. There was a fuel shortage across the whole country, which meant we would wait in line for up to 8 hours just to buy 20 litres of petrol. And I remember one day, a local man was fitting blinds in our living room. The next day, I just happened to see him perched on the side of the road with a knapsack and his gun slung over his shoulder. Suddenly, a jam-packed Toyota Hiace pulled up and on he hopped to be taken to the front lines in the fight against ISIS. By August, ISIS was still on a rampage, continuing to take ground, capturing cities and oil fields and inching closer to our region. Like the rest of the world, we turned on our TVs and watched on helplessly as yet another horrific genocide, the 75th of the Yazidi people, took place. And those harrowing scenes we were watching were tragically so similar to the desperation we've once again witnessed at the Kabul airport in Afghanistan. Though, tragically for the Yazidi people, ISIS eventually captured and enslaved more than 11,000 women and children and executed over 5,000 men and boys. Within a few days, the Australian and US government issued warnings for all citizens to leave Iraq immediately. Many non-government organisations, or NGOs as they're called, began evacuating their staff, and so our NGO requested that we leave as soon and safely as we could. Airlines were cancelling all their flights, and so we sat down with our American colleagues and we hatched up a plan. We're going to leave in the middle of the night by taxi. And we squeezed our family into a Toyota Corolla with a couple of suitcases and a stroller on our laps, and for the next 12 hours went driving. We crossed the border where Iraq, Turkey and Syria all converge, and I still remember being gripped with fear as we left our new home, not knowing if we'd even be able to return, wondering if we were making the mistake by actually leaving, and in our attempts to evacuate, we'd end up being captured by ISIS. But worse was this feeling of guilt, of leaving our new friends and neighbours behind. I've never since forgotten the value of the Australian passport that I hold in my hand today. Within a few weeks, coalition airstrikes, along with the incredible bravery of the local armed forces known as the Peshmerga, who were fighting on the front lines, just like my neighbour. It meant it was safe for us to return home to Suran from our temporary abode in Turkey, and I am here to share with you today what I would learn over the next 3 years in Iraq. My teachers were the generous, hospitable locals in our hometown of Suran, and the courage and resiliency of a few hundred Yazidi and Shabak displaced families, our newest neighbours. I would also discover firsthand how broken the global response to the refugee crisis had become. And I would like to suggest to you today that at the root of the problem is the gross inaccuracy that the media, politicians, and the world at large are perceiving and labelling the now 82.4 million displaced people in our world. Allow me to put that rapidly growing statistic in context for you. That is over 3 times the population of Australia, throw in New Zealand as well, that has been forced to flee their home for no fault of their own. Now, our first order of business when we returned to Iraq was to visit the mayor of Suran, along with a couple of local community leaders, and to ask them how we as an organisation could best serve them as they were responding to the crisis. You see, Suran has historically been known as a city of refuge for many people groups, largely due to its geographical location. It's just 25 kilometres from the border with Iran and 50 kilometres from Turkey. There's towering mountains surrounding the city in every direction, providing this sense of shelter, this protection for thousands of displaced people that have been displaced by both civil war and the Iran-Iraq war. But don't let these majestic mountains behind me deceive you. More than 5 million undocumented landmines have been littered across that stunning landscape, providing a constant reminder of the war and trauma still embedded into this local community. Against all odds, the mayor and the entire Suran community had become experts at building communities of refuge, and so we took their lead. They had identified a particular group of 23 Shabak families. They were in desperate need of emergency accommodation. This particular Muslim minority group of families were ratted out by their not-so-friendly neighbours and fled just an hour before ISIS ransacked their homes and occupied their village. So in a coordinated effort and just 7 days after our return, we transformed an unused portion of land where our NGO was building a community centre to construct a micro-refugee camp. It became the first of actually 7 micro-villages, as we would eventually decide to call them. Months later, I'll never forget a conversation I had with one of the elders of a larger group of Yazidi families that we discovered squatting in some nearby unfinished buildings. At the building site of their soon-to-be completed micro-village, this distressed father grabs me, he pulls me aside and he explains. Just yesterday, he got a call from ISIS offering the return of his daughter if he paid a ransom of $12,000. I stood there, paralysed in thought and emotion. And my mind suddenly raced towards my own wife and children back at home. What if it were my daughter? What would I do to get her back? All I knew is that I would stop at nothing to make a way to get her back. And unlike most stories, this one had a good ending. A few months later, we received word from someone within the Kurdistan regional government that they had located his daughter and a rescue operation had secured her release. And she had made it safely to Germany to receive humanitarian sanctuary and care. All of this was possible through the collaboration with the local government and community leaders, and then with the generous financial help of friends around the world, we were able to expand our efforts to provide education for the hundreds of displaced children in Suran. We also piloted a groundbreaking trauma rehabilitation program for all the men and women in our care, and we eventually built a medical clinic and a school, which itself is this micro example of this success of this dignified new refugee care model. You know, the school provided specialised Arabic and English curriculum in predominantly Kurdish region. They employed both locals and displaced Christian, Muslim, Kurdish, Arabic, teachers working side by side to teach Iraqi, Syrian, Yazidi, Sunni and Shia Muslim students. I mean, it's hard to put in the words how miraculous the education these children were getting alongside people they had been taught to fear, taught to hate, taught to fight. You see, I just rattled off a list of religious and ethnic labels. Labels are powerful. Labels create a narrative, a story, sometimes unintentionally, many times, though, intentionally for good or for worse. And when it comes to the world's displaced, the labels and narratives our society has created is beyond disparaging. Refugees are called displaced, placeless, stateless, undocumented migrants. Acronyms like IDPs, those seeking asylum, are labelled illegal immigrants, boat people, queue jumpers. Their worth and true identity has been hijacked from them, and in the process, the world's most vulnerable to poverty and exploitation of all kinds, and of which 40% are children. They are becoming dehumanised. More recently, the phrase people on the move has been used to lump all displaced people under a single category. And today, I'd like to propose to you a new all-encompassing term for those that have been forcibly displaced from their homes. And that word is Waymakers. When you have witnessed up close and personal, like I have, these fathers and mothers lead their children and elderly and all their extended families to safety, to provision, and realise that they are not just people on the move. They are finding a way. They are making a way. They are waymakers. When we see them in this light, we move from pity to compassion. When we see them as more than just people on the move, but instead waymakers, we empower them with dignity and with hope. And just like the people of Suran who welcomed our sojourning family and gave refuge to thousands displaced by ISIS, we too can choose empowerment over charity, dignity over pity. And I promise you it will make all the difference in the world. And this is how I know. When ISIS was defeated and pushed out of Mosul and Sinjar, do you know who the first families were to pack up their belongings and have the courage to go back and rebuild their devastated communities? The Shabak and Yazidi families from our micro-villages. And these photos behind me are scenes of courage, incredible courage and grief as the time came for these families to say goodbye and head back to their newly liberated homes. In any other time and place, these two Muslim and Yazidi men would have been enemies, but in a few short years, they became brothers. They lived side by side, sharing electricity, water, educating their children together, and serving each other's families, making a way together. A few weeks after most of the families had returned to their homes, our family also returned home to Australia, expecting our fourth child. There, we learned that many Yazidi families had now resettled here in Australia and needed greater assistance. In fact, there was more than 2,500 former refugees from Iraq and Syria now living in Toowoomba. And in 2017, inspired by a hero of mine, poet Maya Angelou, who poetically wrote, "You are only free when you realise you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all." My wife and I then founded the charity You Belong Australia. Alongside the entire Toowoomba community and in partnership with local government and many other great organisations, we began empowering these new waymakers to thrive in their hometown. And today we have several wellbeing, education and training programs and host social and cultural events. And we've just learnt that the first of hopefully many more new Afghan families have now arrived in Toowoomba. And I was speaking with event organisers Clayton and Kathy, who've done a fantastic job last week, and they said I could take a couple more minutes to share about the incredible work happening here in Toowoomba and throughout Australia. But instead of hearing from me, I thought I'd let a friend and former refugee from Afghanistan, Rahila, share some words with you.
Hi, my name is Rahila and I live in Toowoomba, Queensland. Before we moved to Australia, I was quite scared coming to a country where basically everything is different. There's a lot of good stuff. The fact that I can work, I can go to uni, and also the fact that I'm safe. Currently, I'm in my second year of law degree, and I work at Bunnings. I love it, and I love the people. I've learned a lot of Aussie slang. Well, actually, I learned this from my team members. I'm going to use the dunny, which means I'm going to use the toilet. Art is my hobby. I think art shows someone's identity, who they are, what they love, and what experiences they've been through. My art is an expression of my culture, my identity, and I want to share it with the world. To belong means love, respect, kindness, and sharing.
And we can thank our very own Jude Kalman on the Gold Coast here for piecing that story together. Local governments and communities all over Australia have chosen to become welcome zones for refugees, and like Saran and Toowoomba, they are welcoming and empowering these new waymakers. And it's especially in times like this as the world is grappling with so much uncertainty and the so-called new normal that we could all learn a tremendous amount from their brilliance, their tenacity, integrity, and resilience. The kind of creativity and courage it takes to not only survive, but thrive through crisis and great change. And you and I have the privilege to welcome to Australia some of these most remarkable people on the planet. So, will you join me in welcoming our newest neighbours? Will you join me in empowering and looking to the world's displaced as our teachers, wherever they might be on their journey to seek refuge, to find home, until we all belong? And lastly, and certainly not leastly, will you join me